Jane sat on her bed, admiring her engagement ring. The golden band sparkled in the morning light, reminding her of how far she and Mark had come. She smiled, thinking of the boy who used to share his lunch with her during break time in secondary school. Mark had been her best friend, always protecting her from bullies and walking her home after school. Their love story began in high school when they fell deeply in love and even considered engagement. However, everything fell apart when they were told they both carried the AS genotype. Heartbroken, they ended things and went their separate ways. Mark left for university abroad, while Jane stayed back to study locally. For years, they didn't see or hear from each other. 6 months ago, their paths crossed again at a mutual friend's birthday party. The moment their eyes met, it was as if no time had passed. "Hi, Jane," Mark said, smiling. "Hi, Mark," she replied, her heart racing. "It's been a long time." "Yes, too long. We have a lot to catch up on." And catch up they did. Over the next few months, their friendship rekindled and quickly grew into love. Despite their fears about their genotype, they decided to give love another chance. A second test revealed the first result had been wrong. They were both AA. Their happiness knew no bounds. One evening, during a private dinner, Mark got down on one knee and proposed to Jane. With tears of joy, she said yes. The wedding day was meant to be the happiest day of their lives. The church was packed with family and friends, and the couple looked radiant as they exchanged vows. But just as they were about to leave the church, an unexpected guest arrived. Mark froze as his ex-girlfriend, Clara, walked in holding the hand of a little boy who looked just like him. The murmurs among the guests grew louder as Clara walked straight up to Jane and Mark. "Congratulations," Clara said with a tight smile, her eyes cold. "I thought I should introduce you to your stepson, Alex." Jane's heart dropped. "What?" she whispered, looking at Mark. Mark's face was pale, his lips trembling. "Clara, what are you doing here?" "I'm here because you thought you could walk away from your responsibilities," Clara snapped. "This is your son, Mark. Don't think you can marry her and forget about him." The tension was palpable. Jane managed to hold herself together, though her heart was breaking. "This isn't the time or place for this," she said quietly. "We'll talk about it later." Clara smirked. "Oh, I'm sure we will." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Jane and Mark to face their bewildered guests. Despite the drama, they went ahead with the reception, trying to salvage the day. Mark promised Jane he would explain everything later. After the wedding, Mark and Jane flew to a luxurious resort in Paris for their honeymoon. The setting was perfect: golden beaches, luxurious rooms, and candlelit dinners. But behind the romantic facade, things quickly fell apart. On their first night, Mark approached Jane with tenderness, ready to consummate their marriage. But Jane, clearly nervous, gently pushed him away. "Not tonight," she said, avoiding his gaze. Mark was taken aback. "Jane, we're married now. What's wrong?" I can't," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry." Mark was stunned. He had respected her decision to wait until marriage, but now, after waiting so long, he felt rejected. Hurt and frustrated, he booked another room for himself that night, unable to stay in the same space. The next morning, they avoided each other, and by the third day, Mark suggested they cut the honeymoon short. "There's no point staying here if we can't even enjoy it together," he said coldly. Jane agreed, but they lied to their families, claiming they were still enjoying their time in Paris. When they returned home, the cracks in their relationship deepened. Jane's father, a wealthy businessman, had gifted Mark a house and a car as a wedding present. But instead of bringing them closer, the new home seemed to widen the gap. Mark became distant, spending long hours at work. When he was home, he barely spoke to Jane. The tension was unbearable. One morning, Jane tried to talk to him. "Mark, We need to talk about what's going on." "There's nothing to talk about," Mark said, not looking up from his phone. "There is," Jane insisted. "We've been distant since the honeymoon. What's wrong?" Mark snapped. "What's wrong?" "You tell me, Jane. You've been cold and distant since day one. This isn't what I signed up for." Jane was hurt, but tried to remain calm. "You think this is easy for me? You think I don't know something is wrong?" Their arguments became frequent. Mark's frustration over their lack of intimacy and Jane's inability to open up created a toxic cycle. The unresolved issue of Clara and Alex only added fuel to the fire. One evening, Clara called Mark, demanding financial support for Alex. Jane overheard the conversation and confronted him. "Why didn't you tell me about your son?" she demanded. "I didn't know how to," Mark admitted. "I was scared of losing you." "Well, congratulations," Jane said bitterly. "You're losing me anyway." From that day on, things only got worse. Every morning, Mark and Jane woke up with hatred in their eyes for each other. They argued over everything: dirty laundry, unwashed dishes, and even the way they arranged the pillows on the bed. Mark often complained about Jane's inability to cook. "I can't keep eating outside like I'm still a bachelor," he shouted one evening. Jane, hurt but defensive, snapped back. "Well, I'm trying. It's not like I've done this before." One day, Jane almost burned the house down while frying plantains. Smoke filled the kitchen, and Mark came rushing in. "What is wrong with you? Can't you do anything right?" he yelled. Jane stood there, embarrassed and shaking. "I said I'm trying." But her efforts were never enough. Mark's frustration with Jane's cooking and her inability to run the house added fuel to their constant arguments. Jane had been working for her wealthy father during their relationship. She was ambitious and independent, but when they got married, Mark insisted she quit her job to become a full-time housewife. "You'll take care of me, the house, and our children," he had said confidently. Jane reluctantly agreed, trusting that their life together would be blissful. Her father was furious, but refrained from interfering. "It's your marriage, Jane," he had said. "I won't tell you to disobey your husband." Things took a sharp turn when Mark lost his job. His frustration at home had seeped into his work, and after a series of mistakes, he was fired. Without an income, their savings began to dwindle. One evening, Mark burst into the kitchen where Jane was struggling with dinner. "This is all your fault," he shouted. Jane turned to him, startled. "What are you talking about?" "I lost my job, and it's because of you. You're a witch, Jane. You've cursed my life." Jane's eyes widened. "Are you insane? How is that my fault?" "You're the reason I can't focus," Mark fumed. "You've brought me nothing but bad luck." Jane, fed up, retorted, "Maybe you lost your job because you're incompetent. Stop blaming me for your failures." The argument ended with Mark storming out of the kitchen, leaving Jane in tears. To make matters worse, Jane hadn't conceived. Each month brought disappointment, and Mark began using her inability to have children against her in every fight. "At least I'm functioning," Mark sneered during one heated argument. "I have a son. What about you? You're barren." Jane's heart shattered every time he said those words. She would cry herself to sleep, fearing that Mark might return to his ex, Clara, and their son, Alex. With no income and the bills piling up, Jane swallowed her pride and begged her father to employ Mark. "Please, Daddy," she said. "Just give him a job. We're struggling." Her father, still hurt by Jane leaving his company, refused. "Let him be the man he claims to be," he said firmly. "He should find a job on his own. Stop finding jobs for him." Jane pleaded, but her father wouldn't budge. When Mark found out about her request, he was furious. "You went begging your father for help? Do you think I'm useless?" "I was just trying to help," Jane cried. "I don't need your help," Mark snapped. "I'm a man. I'll handle it myself." But he didn't. Days turned into weeks, and Mark remained jobless. His resentment toward Jane grew, and their fights became unbearable. Mark's bitterness boiled over one night during another argument. "You're barren, Jane," he yelled. "No peace, no children, no nothing. It's like I married a witch." Jane's eyes filled with tears. "A witch? Me? You're the one who's useless. You couldn't even keep your job, and now you're blaming me for everything." Mark turned to face her with fury. "At least I had a job to lose, but you... What have you ever done besides nagging?" Jane shoved him hard. "Get out!" she shouted. "Go! If you think I'm the problem, then leave. Don't ever come back." Mark grabbed his bag and stormed out of the house without another word. Jane slammed the door behind him angrily. After Mark stormed out of the house, leaving Jane alone, she spent her days in silence. At first, the absence felt like relief, but as the days turned into weeks, the silence became unbearable. Jane found herself checking her phone constantly, hoping for a call or a message from Mark, but it never came. Her pride held her back from calling him, even though she missed him desperately. One night, as Jane lay in bed, she had a terrifying dream. She and Mark were sitting at a wooden table, smiling and talking like they used to in the early days of their relationship. Suddenly, a faceless figure approached them with a covered dish, placing it on the table with a sinister smile. When they opened the dish, their smiles vanished. The plate was filled with wriggling earthworms. They tried to stand up and push the plate away, but the faceless figure began flogging them with a whip, forcing them to eat the worms. As Jane put the first worm in her mouth, she woke up screaming. Her heart was pounding heavily, and she sat up in bed clutching her chest. The dream felt so real that she couldn't shake off the feeling of dread. The next night, the dream came again, exactly the same way. This time, Jane couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. She knew something was wrong, and that she needed help. The following morning, Jane went to a nearby church and asked to see the pastor. She was taken to his office, where she poured out her heart, telling him about her disastrous marriage, Mark's departure, and the disturbing dreams she had been having. The pastor listened carefully, nodding as she spoke. When she finished, he leaned forward and said, "Jane, your marriage is under attack. These dreams are not ordinary. They are a sign of spiritual manipulation. We need to pray and ask God to reveal the roots of this problem." Jane nodded tearfully. "Pastor, I don't know what to do. Mark has left me. I don't even know where he is. I feel so alone." The pastor comforted her. "Don't be afraid. God will fight for you. Stay here and pray with us." Jane didn't return home that day. She stayed at the church, praying fervently for God's intervention. She cried out for mercy, asking God to expose the truth. The next morning, the pastor came to meet her at the altar, his face serious. "Jane, God revealed some things to me last night." "What did he show you, Pastor?" Jane asked anxiously. The pastor took a deep breath and led her to his office. As they sat down, he said, "After your wedding day, Clara, your husband's ex-girlfriend, took your wedding picture to a native doctor. She tore the photograph apart in a ritual to signify the tearing of your marriage. She cursed Mark never to have peace for leaving her and their son for you." Jane froze, her eyes wide with shock. "Clara? But she was never truly in a relationship with Mark. How could she do this to us?" The pastor nodded grimly. "Clara was jealous. She knew Mark was in love with you years ago, but when she found out you were both AS, she used that as an opportunity to force herself into his life. She manipulated him, and one reckless night, she got pregnant. Mark, being a responsible man, promised to take care of the child, but made it clear he wasn't in love with her. When he left the country, Clara felt abandoned and vowed to destroy him if he ever married someone else." Jane's hands trembled. This explains everything. The fights, the bitterness, and even the dreams. But Pastor, how can we undo this? The pastor took her hands and said, "We will pray fervently to break every curse Clara has placed on your marriage. God's power is greater than any evil." For the next 6 hours, Jane prayed with the pastor and church members, crying out to God for deliverance. As the prayers intensified, she felt a weight lifting from her chest. Mark, who had left Jane, was now staying with Clara, his ex, and their son. He believed he was in love with her, and together they often talked about their future and the possibility of getting married. Clara was overjoyed, thinking she had finally won Mark's heart. One evening, as they sat in the living room discussing their plans, their son walked in from Clara's bedroom holding something small and plastic in his hand. "Mommy, what's this?" the boy asked innocently. Mark looked up, confused. The boy was holding a used condom. "Clara," Mark said slowly, his voice laced with suspicion, "why is there a used condom in this house? Are you seeing another man?" Clara's face turned pale, and her hands trembled. She rushed to snatch the condom from the boy, but her panic only made Mark more suspicious. "Answer me, Clara," Mark demanded, his voice rising. "Why is there a used condom here? Who does it belong to?" Clara stammered, her words coming out in fragments. It's not what you think, Mark. I swear." "Then what is it?" Mark pressed. "Explain yourself." Realizing she had no way out, Clara burst into tears. She dropped to her knees, clutching the condom in her hands. "Mark, please forgive me," she sobbed. "I didn't want to lose you. I was desperate." Mark's confusion deepened. "What are you talking about? What does this have to do with me?" Clara looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. This is the condom you used that night we slept together," she confessed. "I kept it. I took it to a native doctor, and he told me how to use it to bind you to me forever." Mark took a step back, horror spreading across his face. "What?" "I burst it on purpose that night," Clara continued, her voice trembling. "And later I kept it. The native doctor said it was the only way to make sure you would never leave me, even if you didn't love me. He warned me that no one else should ever see it." Mark was speechless. His mind raced as he processed her words. His heart pounded as a strange sensation washed over him, like a fog lifting. Suddenly, he felt as though he had woken up from a dream. He looked around the room, disoriented. "Where am I?" he muttered, his voice trembling. Clara panicked, realizing the spell had been broken. She grabbed his arm, begging him to listen. "Mark, I did it because I love you. I couldn't bear to see you with Jane. I thought if you stayed with me, you'd learn to love me back." Mark shook his head in disbelief. "You've been using witchcraft to manipulate me? To destroy my marriage?" Clara nodded, trembling. "I didn't know what else to do. Please, Mark, forgive me." Just then, Mark's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and saw Jane's name flashing. For a moment, he hesitated, but then he answered. "Mark." Jane's voice was steady but emotional. "I need you to come to Lagos. I've been praying for you, and there's something important you need to know." Mark felt a lump in his throat. "I'm on my way," he said, hanging up the phone. Ignoring Clara's desperate pleas, Mark packed his things and left immediately. His heart was heavy with regret and shame, but he knew he had to make things right with Jane. When Mark arrived in Lagos, he went straight to the church where Jane was waiting. As soon as he saw her, he broke down in tears. "Jane," he whispered, "I'm so sorry. I've been such a fool." Jane hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Mark, I'm just glad you're back." Mark poured out his heart, confessing everything Clara had done and how he had been under her spell. The pastor joined them, praying for their reconciliation and asking God to restore their love and protect their marriage. As they talked, Jane revealed a painful secret. "Mark, I need to tell you something. Remember our first day together when I didn't want to?" Mark nodded, curiosity and concern etched on his face. Jane took a deep breath. "I was raped by my teacher when I was younger. It's left me with a deep fear of intimacy. I was scared of being hurt again, of losing control." Mark's eyes widened in shock and horror. "Oh, Jane, I'm so sorry," Mark whispered, pulling her close. "I had no idea. I'm sorry I didn't understand. Sorry I wasn't there for you." Jane's tears flowed freely as Mark held her, apologizing for not being more supportive, for not being there to protect her. The pastor prayed with them, asking God to heal Jane's emotional wounds and restore their relationship. As they prayed, Mark felt a deep sense of regret and sorrow, but also a renewed commitment to loving and supporting Jane. 3 months later, Jane had joyous news. She was pregnant. Mark hugged her tightly, his heart filled with gratitude and love. "Thank God, we're finally going to be parents." From that day on, they rebuilt their lives with love, faith, and forgiveness, confident that nothing could break what God had restored. Mark made sure to be more supportive and understanding, and Jane slowly began to heal from her past trauma. The story highlights the importance of communication, empathy, and understanding in relationships, as well as the need for spiritual strength and forgiveness in overcoming challenges.